Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the interactions between suicide, freedom, and happiness. I am Tyler Qualls, a quantitative economics and applied mathematics major here at Boise State University. I would first like to begin this presentation by discussing what the objectives of this research were. The objectives were to investigate the relationship between happiness and suicide outside of the United States, specifically by expanding on previous research by including measures of freedom, such as economic freedom and basic, more general human freedom, as well as by including more data by including Asia, Africa, and South America. Before we dive into what this paper actively does, let us first look at what happened previously in the field regarding this topic. This paper, Dark Contrasts, the Paradox of High Rates of Suicide in Happy Places, covered the idea that there was a positive correlation between happiness and suicide, as previous research had shown. They began by simulating the previous studies by using countries in the western part of Europe, and they found that it was true that there was a positive correlation between happiness and suicide rate. So they decided, in order to mitigate
the cultural differences between countries, to use a more homogeneous sample of data, and they decided to use the states within the United States of America, and they found that there was also a positive correlation within these states. So the conclusions that they came across were that the happiness-suicide paradox holds true when they were replicating previous studies on European nations, and that the paradox continues to hold true when using states as a more homogeneous sample. They also theorized that possible causes of this paradox was because of relative happiness, as similar to the Easterlin paradox, being less happy than everyone around you may have more impact on the suicide rate rather than the overall happiness. They also attributed a possibility is their lack of individual characteristics, as they didn't include any statistics on race, income, religiosity, or any other individual characteristics.
This second paper is a reply to Dark Contrasts, the previous paper, and it decided to expand on their methodology, except instead of using states in the United States, they elected to use counties in order to get a more homogeneous data set that would be, in their idea, more accurate. They also added in many control variables that had been missing from the first study. And they found that there was not a negative correlation between happiness and suicide. You can see on the right the regression table that shows various different rates, such as marriage rate, divorce rate, poverty rate, all of which are in there as control variables, as well as you can see that they added in regressors for the region and the racial composition of the counties that they were looking at. This third paper is a meta-analysis on the connections between suicide and happiness. And most of their correlations are interesting, but only two are particularly important for the regressions in this paper. And that is that they found that employment increases happiness, as well as it decreases the likelihood of suicide. And they found that the gender of someone had no effect on happiness, but that men commit 2 to 3 times more suicide than women. However, women attempt suicide 7 to 8 times more. They also noted that over the last 150 years, the ratio of male to female suicide rates has been decreasing due to more women successfully committing suicide and fewer men in older age ranges committing suicide. They concluded that the correlation between happiness and suicide seems to be dependent on whether the variable is achieved or ascribed. An achieved variable is something that you achieved, such as getting a job or graduating college or becoming married. And an ascribed variable is something that's assigned to you, be it at birth or over time as you are born male, female, and or age, where as you get older it seems to affect people differently than just getting a job. Now that we all have some background information on this topic, I would like to talk about the data sets that were used for this report. We began by getting the World Health Organization's mortality database's suicide statistics. It broke up the variables it gave us into year, what region of the world the country was in, the country, whether the suicide rate was for the male or female population of the country, as well as the suicide rate per 100,000 people for the male or female side. And on the right, you can see a map of the world with the countries colored based on how many suicides they have per 100,000 people. Continuing, we looked at the World Happiness Report in order to get our happiness measurement. And the World Happiness Report's database had the World Happiness Score, the country, what region of the world they were from, and the happiness score indicator proportions. These were the proportion of effect that the different forms of happiness affected the index score for a country. They were economy, family, health, freedom, trust in the government, generosity, and the dystopia residual. The dystopia residual discussed how close or far away the country was from being a perfectly bad nation when it came to this. The next data set that we got the information from is from the Cato Institute's Human Freedom Index. This data set didn't have much in terms of breakdown, but it gave us a human freedom measurement as well as what country it came from, all from the years from 2008 to 2017. On the right, you can see a world map of the country's human freedom. The Heritage Foundation was the final data set that we ended up using, and it's the Index of Economic Freedom. This index included the Economic Freedom Score, which was made up of the Economic Freedom Score indicators, which are listed on the right, as well as it included a number of general country indicators, which are also listed on the right. This data set also included the change in all of the Economic Freedom Score indicators, and we will not be using most of these variables as we just found them to not be applicable, as well as we removed some of them in as multicollinearity would have been caused. This is a map of the economic freedom of the world from the Heritage Foundation's study. So after combining all of them, we ended up with having 132 countries with 2 observations per country regarding sex. That is why our N is 264. And we are using the list of statistics here as every variable that we're using in our regressions. This is not all-inclusive of every variable that was included within our data sets. However, this is the list that is applied in this presentation, as the full list would take far too long to go through. Something important to note on this is that IF, IR, and CR are all marked as 0, and this is in fact not a false observation. This is due to the fact that Qatar had a income tax rate, a corporate tax rate of 0, which led their investment freedom to also be 0. It's also important to note that due to the crossover of the years, we ended up using the year of 2015 for this data set. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with the data set, we can begin to look at the methodology that this paper ends up using. We begin by doing a qualitative analysis of the data set we have, and we find that depending on the region, it seems to determine the effect of happiness on the suicide rates, as well as the scores for economic and human freedom to suicide rates. If we look at the first set of graphs on the left, we can see that Asia Pacific seems to have an extremely high correlation between happiness and suicide rates, as it is just very positive. Whereas looking at the Middle East and North Africa, its happiness score is negatively correlated with the crude suicide rate, so it decreases as their happiness increases. And for most of these regions, it seems to be consistent across all three indicators, being happiness score, human freedom score, and economic freedom score. However, Europe swaps. When we're looking at happiness, its suicide rate increases as people are happier. But if we're looking at human freedom and economic freedom, it seems to have a negative correlation between suicide rate and the scores. Whereas every other region seems to be consistent. This is an anomaly that I'm not sure what is being caused by. It's possible it's just a societal difference between European countries versus the other regions, but I can't be certain. Additionally, North America's graphs are relatively positive. However, with only 3 countries within the region of North America, its line is less than reliable, so we'll take that with a grain of salt. Moving on, we did a correlation matrix in order to make sure we avoided any multicollinearity in our regression. And we found that a couple of our indicators were correlated with our economic freedom breakdown indicators. And the first of those is that FISF is correlated with the income tax rate. GS, or government spending, is correlated with the tax burden and the government expenditure, which makes sense. We also have MF, monetary freedom, is correlated with inflation, also somewhat makes sense. And so these are important to keep in mind while we begin to look at regressions. This project is using OLS regressions with fixed effects for region, as well as male and female binaries. So these 3 regressions were the best of our Lin-Lin regressions, where we were looking directly at the crude suicide rate versus the scores for each of the scores. And we found that using the breakdowns of the economic freedom score gave us better results with more statistically significant pieces of information. Just looking at these 3 regressions, we can see that across the board, while statistically insignificant, the happiness score is negatively correlated with the crude suicide rate, disagreeing with the dark paradox that was claimed at the beginning of this. We can also see that the human freedom, and it seems to be positively correlated with crude suicide. So as human freedoms increase, you're more likely to commit suicide, which seems counterintuitive. Then we can see for all 3 regressions that the male binary variable has a lot of sway on the overall suicide rate, in that it's statistically significant at all levels, as well as its coefficient is much higher than any of the other coefficients. This was demonstrated in the graphs we looked at, where the male versus female suicide rates were much favored in male suicides being much higher. We can also look at the adjusted R-squareds for all of these regressions and see that on the left it starts out with an R-squared of 0.406, the middle one being a 0.419, and the one on the right being a 0.424. Those are pretty good. We can also note that the F statistic is statistically significant at all levels, meaning all of the variables we have included in these seem to be important. So we decided to look at the plot of the residuals in order to see whether we could improve these R-squareds via a logarithm, or if it wouldn't do any good. And it seemed that there was some amount of non-randomness in these residuals, in that it seemed to follow a relative curve. That could demonstrate that we're missing a variable within our residuals, but we should be able to negate most of it with a logarithm. Though specifically looking at these, we can see that the mean of the residuals is very close to 0 in all cases, with the regression 3 also having the lowest mean of residuals as well as the highest explanatory power. Though we'll see what happens when we take the logarithm, which is what happens here. So here we took the logarithm of the crude suicide rate in order to negate as much of the variance in our residuals as possible. And we can see that we actually have a statistically significant happiness score here, and it is a negative coefficient in regression 3. But we can also see that property rights PR has shown up and is statistically significant now. Our LF, which is labor freedom, is statistically significant now in both regressions 2 and 3 at the 5% interval. We can also see that IF, investment freedoms, has become significant at the 1% level for both regressions 2 and 3. As well as we can see that on all 3 of these regressions, the human freedom indicator is also statistically significant, though it's more statistically significant in regression 3. With these regressions, we still see that the male variable has a larger than the rest influence on the crude suicide rate, with a coefficient of 1, whereas everyone else is less than 1. And we can also see that it's statistically significant at all places. We can also see that the MENA variable, which is the fixed effect for the Middle East and North Africa, is statistically significant on all of these. And then our PD, which is the public debt, is statistically significant in both of the regressions that have it. Continuing down, we can look at the adjusted R-squared to see that these regressions have become far more effective at explaining why everything's going on, with an adjusted R-squared of 0.564 at the lowest, a 0.583 in the middle regression, and the final regression having an adjusted R-squared of 0.592, which is really good. We can also see that the F statistic has increased substantially for all of these. They continue to be statistically significant at all levels, but they're now just much higher than the previous regressions we looked at. Now let's see what taking the logarithm of the previous regressions has done to their plot of residuals. So here are the 3 residual plots, and we can see that some things have changed. No longer is there a clear parabolic curve. We now have a much squirvier line that looks much more randomly distributed. As well as something interesting happened in that the mean of the residuals for regression 1 is now lower than the mean of the residuals for regression 2 and 3. Regression 3 is still lower than regression 2 though, but it is interesting that regression 1's mean of residuals has become lower. Now that we've taken a look at some of the best regressions that were run for this project, we can begin to interpret them and draw conclusions from them. So we decided that the most effective regression that we ran was the third regression from the table of regressions using the logarithm of crude suicide rates. And we came to this conclusion by prioritizing the R-squared, even though its mean of the residuals was slightly lower than the first regression from the same table. We made this decision due to the fact that the difference between the mean of the residuals was negative 10 to the 15th versus negative 10 to the 16th. And we thought that was marginal enough to rely on the higher R-squared from this regression. We can then look at this regression and begin to interpret it. So the way you interpret this regression is when you increase one of the variables by 1, we expect that the crude suicide rate will decrease by 100 times that percentage. So when we increase H-score by 1, we expect the crude suicide rate to decrease by 12.89%. So this regression shows no evidence that the dark paradox happens regarding happiness. However, it does show evidence of a dark paradox with human freedom, where as human freedom increases, suicides go up as well. So the implications of this is that a happier populace seems less likely to commit suicide. A freer population seems more likely to commit suicide. Men on average have 100% more suicides per capita than women. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. As discussed in the literature previously, women seem to attempt suicides to 8 times the number of times men do on average. So we would need to get different data in order to measure the full impact of that. We then also found that region-fixed effects seem to be statistically insignificant in most cases as compared to North America. So moving on to the future, I think that we need to include time series data to see if the changes over time that happen to populations with increasing wealth or decreasing wealth, if they affect the suicide rates more or less than just looking at the stationary time. Then we should also use smaller regions of data, similar to how the response to dark contrasts used counties. Doing something similar but on a world scale, I feel would be a much more effective way to focus on each individual section and maybe give us more reliable regressions. I also think that including a variable for the number of attempted suicides would be extremely good in order to minimize the male versus female biases that seem to occur, as including the male versus female suicide rates made it statistically significant and almost irrelevantized many of the other independent variables when we were testing. We also think that adding instrumental variables for many of the control variables we used would be very helpful. So using, for example, government expenditure and as an instrument variable for government spending might be useful, though more research would need to go into to determine whether it would truly be relevant as well as truly be exogenous. So more research would need to go into there. We also think that using more specific measures of freedom would help to reduce any multiclinearity that we might have, as well as to pinpoint what parts of freedom hurt and help individuals, as reducing financial freedom in order to increase financial or labor freedom could help or hurt, and we can't tell with our current regressions. We also think that including more individualistic control variables would be a good addition, as we currently aren't including any race demographics. We're just assuming that the country fixed effect is controlling for those things. Thank you all for watching this presentation. Here are my references, and if you have any questions, please ask me in person at our assigned presentation time.